Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. It's Cardigans for Kindness Day, I noticed in the program, so I'm doing the best I can. This is the closest to a cardigan I have. Thank you so much for joining us for our session today on equity, diversity, inclusion, and collection development. We're so happy you're joining us here on this rainy Friday. And we're gonna get right into our panel with some introductions by each of us. But first we wanted to start with a statement of positionality. So we are a panel of white people with considerable privilege working in a space in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we just wanted to acknowledge that ourselves, our organizations, are predominantly white organizations, and we are dedicated to working through that, I think, with all of you, and very similar to, I think, our organizations reflect the same situation that libraries are in, which is kind of, in a way, at the crux of many of the issues that our organizations face in trying to diversify collections. So I'll start with introducing myself and my research and engagement on this topic. My name is Marilee Prophet. I'm a senior manager with the OCLC Research Library Partnership, part of OCLC Research. And at the end of last year, I had the privilege and opportunity to do this bit of exploratory research, talking to institutions who have been engaged with diversifying collections. And we have this blog post on the OCLC Research blog hanging together that summarizes some of those findings. And I'll be sharing and exploring those topics with my panelists today. And I will pass things over to Mark.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark McBride. I'm from Ithaca S&R. In the program, briefly, it said I was from OCLC. I think that's been corrected, so just to make sure, and a shout out to my colleagues in the room from S&R. So I'm going to be talking mostly about the work we did with Leading by Diversifying Collections. You'll notice that I am not an author on this publication, but most of the time in S&R, we cross-pollinate in our research and we read each other's work and we become informed by our colleagues' research. And this particular topic is critical, especially for the portfolio I represent. We are looking at organizational transformation and belonging inside organizations, not only libraries, but museums and archives and across higher education. Looking at how I say the United States in particular has responded to this need to diversify not only our organizations but our collecting bodies has been very inspiring. And part of what we're hoping to accomplish in the next few years is to start working with a number of organizations in the States and in Canada as well, to start thinking about how this work can inform organizational strategies moving forward, because I don't think the collections work can be done without moving the organization as a whole through this entire process. And I'll be talking about that quite a bit today.
Thank you, Mark. Yes, my name's Andy Breeding. I am a senior product manager at OCLC, and I have responsibility for our collection analytics tools, Choreo Insights and Greenglass. And for about the last 10 years, I've been involved in analysis projects, supporting in the monograph space, working on deselection projects, on shared print projects, and over this time frame, I've increasingly seen libraries focus on titles which I would call local interest, and increasingly that lens is taking on a more DEI flavor. And so what I want to talk about today is just share the experiences of sort of how that's evolved, how some of the analysis tools that we provide, we're working to bring in different metadata, more granular ways to analyze collections. So I'm going to come at it more or less from sort of the data analyst side, the data nerd side.
Okay, thanks. So we're going to jump into our first question here, which is what does this work look like, and who is undertaking the work, and what are their motivations? And Andy, we'll just go ahead and start with you.
So just following on to what I mentioned about projects that I've been working on, what I've seen in this view, I'm sort of looking back over kind of the recent past. I'm seeing efforts among shared print projects, for instance, to be able to identify materials that should be protected at a greater rate. So I think in 2018, I worked on a project with the COPL consortium in Western Canada. And so as part of their shared print modeling, they looked at, they created a flag, we called it COPL Canadiana. And so it included things of local interest. So we've done projects for a long time where local interest materials were identified. But this one had a lot of indigenous place names, languages, other codes. So what we did is anything that could be encoded in a MARC record, we could analyze and create a flag. And so what they chose to do was retain titles at a greater rate that sort of met that category of COPL Canadiana. And so we also see this happening in individual projects where libraries, in many cases, where they're deselection projects, they're deciding what materials they should be removing from their print collections. And so always, and for many projects, the focus has been, well, which things should we absolutely protect? Doesn't matter if it hasn't been used. It could be, it's important to keep it. So some titles may be important regardless of use. So in those cases, I think it was University of New Mexico, actually no, it was Mexico State University. They created a number of protection rules, and they focused on things like indigenous communities, but also things like water rights. And so that's, if I look back, those are the things that I see from an analysis point of view. And but in the next question, we'll talk about sort of like, well, where's that pivoting? And so with that, I'll turn it over.
Yeah. So Mark.
Yeah. So we're thinking about like who's undertaking this work and what the motivations are. And we had talked briefly on a Zoom call last week or 2 weeks ago. And when you think about this work being conducted inside collecting organizations and specifically inside academic libraries, I think we're almost narrowly focused on the people who are responsible for collections and preserving and maintaining our collections. In our report, what we saw was that collections people and certainly are taking on a brunt of this work, but it's also it's more impactful, and I would say approached with a certain amount of grace and honesty when it's something that spreads across an organization. And so in our report, we intentionally didn't want to prescribe a process, because one thing that was obvious is everybody's going through a learning phase right now and how to approach this. There were a number of institutions that I would like to call out, because I think that their work is kind of like that beacon in this space right now. And I look at places like the University of Colorado at Boulder. The way they're approaching diversifying their collections is really intentional, and it's also it's something it's beyond just the people inside the collections roles inside the organization. It's a top-down and a bottom-up purposeful exploration into enhancing the context within the collections, but also understanding that the collections themselves are there to serve all the students and faculty on the campus, and they have to be mindful of their approach to diversify that work. And there's a number of publishers that are stepping into this space as well that I think are again, with a certain amount of grace, trying to understand their role in diversifying the process and how work is being published. You know, Elsevier has a set of tools, and they're very transparent on their process, as well as Sage and others. And then I think, you know, EBSCO, who was we gratefully received sponsorship from for this work. You know, they have put together an aggregate of resources that libraries can call upon to not only signal that they're being very intentional in diversifying their collection, but they're also raising, I would say, the bar for the rest of us to think about what we mean when we say library collection and the reason why certain collections are part of the fabric of a library.
Thanks, Mark. In my research, I just want to clarify, I spoke with, it's a very small sample. These were structured conversations with 8 institutions. They're all on the larger side, and they're all institutions that have already been engaged in this work for some time. So, you know, they may have a different portfolio than other organizations, people who may be represented in the work in this room or in this work. So it's not to suggest that this is everybody's path. In some cases, this work was very focused. People were looking at particular communities, so indigenous communities or native. In Las Vegas, they talked about the importance of the Hawaiian community. Interesting to me was that Las Vegas is one of the largest concentrations of Hawaiian residents, so that was kind of an interesting. Just kind of looking at what the local focus on. In other places, they were really, we were talking to collection managers who don't want to speak on behalf of the work of individual selectors, and really emphasize that they were thinking about, in a sort of holistic way, how do we rethink things from kind of from the top down and think about just the overall practices rather than going to a very targeted area. There's very much an awareness that these library collections are not as diverse as they need to be. And as Mark said, I think that in all of these organizations, this work was very much grounded in anti-racist work that had been happening in the library for some time. So very often there was an anti-racist group that had started within the library in the 2018 or 2019 time period, and they kind of tied what was going on in collection development and diversifying collections to this anti-racist work that had started in the library, and maybe had started with things like thinking about shifting special collections. So our work was really looking at monograph collecting, but that work had really transferred from thinking about reparative description in special collections in finding aids to thinking more holistically about how the library could diversify collections in a broader way. And another interesting thing is that we asked, are you being motivated by what's going on campus? So is this kind of tied to the campus mission, or is this really, you know, we probed for that in all of our conversations. And in, I think, almost all cases, the library said that while this was supporting what was going on at the campus, they really saw the libraries as leading in this. And I think that is backed up by some of the research that Ithaca S&R has done as well, that this is an area where the library is seen as leading in this work, so that I think that this is a really great thing. And I will also echo another thing that Mark referenced, Canada. And I would say that in Canada, kind of universally, you see that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work that has been done in Canada which has created a mandate. And I think in my experience talking to Canadian librarians, there is a shared understanding and a shared national mandate to do right and to do differently to work to support the First Nation, Métis, and Inuit communities in Canada. So I would say that that's kind of a differentiator between institutions here and in the United States. So with that as a setup, we're going to turn to our second question with what does this work look like now? And Mark, I'll ask you to kick off on this one.
Sure. And so, you know, we were talking before we took the stage about one thing that really struck me, and I don't know, maybe it's because I'm much more aware now than I have been in the past, but it seemed at this conference in particular that there was a theme around the culture inside of our organizations, and that people were open in dialogue and conversations about what their culture is inside their organization, how they address those themes. Toxicity in the workplace or joy in the workplace is what we all aspire for, but also how we are addressing diversity, equity, and inclusion and access, not only within our collections, but also in the other services that libraries provide to the community. And so thinking about what does this work look like now, this work, it appears to constantly be shifting and growing and becoming, I would say, something that is going to last within the field. And the reason that I'm saying that I am confident that this is something that we can say will be part of the fabric of libraries moving forward is that we know there are a number of states in the union that are starting to put up barriers to this work. But I've talked to a number of colleagues, and I'm sure all of you have as well, here at the conference that are represented by those states, that come from those states, and they're not stopping this work, which I think is an inspiration that we should all heed. And then for all of us who are fortunate enough to be in states where those barriers have not been put in place, it's on us to continue moving forward, maybe at a faster pace than our colleagues can. So what does this work look like now? It seems that this work is not going to end, and it's starting to mature as well, because there's different voices being represented in the conversations. There's different university administrators that are starting to sit up and take notice that this work can be done. You know, before I came to Ithaca, I was at SUNY System Administration. And a number of our junior librarians across the system came to us and said, we want to start looking at diversifying our collections. And I'll be honest, in my role at the SUNY system, I was overwhelmed by that concept. One, I didn't know where to start, and I didn't know how to support that work. And we spent a considerable amount of time thinking through strategies and thinking about how to implement this. And one of the greatest pieces of advice I ever received in my career was one that I had to fall back on, is take small bites at the apple. Don't try to boil the ocean. So we leaned in on the people inside the SUNY system that were passionate about this work, and they were our guiding light. And I believe that I was talking to some colleagues last night from the SUNY system. There's a publication they're about to release in the next couple weeks about the work that they have taken on to diversify the collections across the university system. So this work, the way it looks now, is always evolving, but it is continuing. And I think that that's the most important thing for all of us to remain focused on.
So I'll go next, and I will say that one of the things that was surprising to me in undertaking this work in 2017, OCLC Research did a survey among institutions in the OCLC Research Library Partnership, and we asked which areas of library work are you seeking to move forward with EDI, and where do you feel like you need more help and support? And at that time, people said that they were diversifying collections. So when we came back around at the end of 2022 and interviewed people, it was somewhat surprising to me given the results of that survey, where people were already investing, that it still felt like it was at a very formative work. But I think that, or a very formative phase. But I think as Mark said, this is work that is ongoing, and that may feel like you're always at the beginning, or you're always learning, or you're always evolving. So that was one thing about, I think, where what this work looks like now is still in a formative stage, and it may look like that for some time, and I think that's okay. The collections work has always really been tied to, the people are really central to collections work, and that's something that we heard, is that a lot of collection development work is really kind of like old-fashioned shoe leather, right? Going out and talking to communities, talking to your faculty, talking to people who are much closer to the research and to the action than you are. I would say what feels a little different in talking to people about diversifying collections is there's much more of an emphasis on connecting directly with people who are in communities, so getting off campus, talking to people who are of the community, understanding what it is they call themselves, what they consider to be relevant voices, what they consider to be authentically diverse, and that desire to forge trusting relationships off campus. I think that a lot of people recognize that that was a challenge, that the library may not be seen as a trusted community partner, but people were really interested in investing the time to make those trusted efforts. The other thing that I think things look like is that people are really treating things as pilots. So in one case, an institution was earmarking for them a relatively small amount of money, like $6,000, and saying, we're going to spend very purposefully in this area, we're going to spend very differently in this area for a year. Or we're going to spend, another institution said, we're going to spend a year where collectively we're going to focus on one community, one particular area, and really build out our collections in that area. And then next year, maybe we'll take a different focus, so sort of a sprint approach. And then finally, I think that some institutions talked about this approach of partnering with a Black, Indigenous, or people of color owned business, so a bookstore or bookseller, and doing a couple of institutions talked about this. One of them called it reparative collecting, which I thought was a really nice way to think about and encapsulate this. But this is a way to partner with an organization that has that connection with community, that has that expertise and can help bring that into your organization. You may be paying more on a per piece basis to work with that organization, which can present some challenges because you may get pushback from money tenders at your institution who may say, wait, why are you paying more for this book than you may from, like Amazon or something, but that money going into local communities and going directly to support communities was something that people are really interested in doing. And I saw, in fact, a poster yesterday, which I believe was from Haverford College, who's doing a very similar thing, but with students going and doing the buying on behalf of the organization, but with the appointed bookstore. So I thought that was a interesting take on things. So Andy, what about you?
Marilee. In my position, I talk a lot with libraries that are contemplating collection analysis projects. And so I guess first and foremost, I would say that right now, I'm sensing it's sort of at the beginning, this really strong interest that I'm seeing in how do we quantify the diversity in our collection, how do we protect it, how do we promote it. So, and to your point, Mark, I'm seeing among some of these libraries, librarians, a lot of passion for the topic. So a real enthusiasm to, to finally be able to, do something positive, in this way. So I've been seeing that. As far as sort of the analysis piece goes, we've added some things to our Green Glass product to be able to look at things like place of publication. How do we quantify the voice of the underrepresented voices as we look at, say, deselection or shared print? With our Choreo Insights product, we're looking to bring a lot more metadata to be able to, just at a very granular level, to be able to create a profile or characterize what we see as a facet of diversity. So, and it's really up to the libraries to decide what that is. And I think librarians are struggling for where to go. Is there a formula I can follow? I've seen some interest in, are there lists that we can compare to? So in fact, some of this initial research started with taking a look at that. And while it's a very blunt instrument, librarians who are very stressed for time, and this is something else that they need to work on, they're looking for, is there a tool that can help with that? So there's the question of lists, and then the Choreo tool is more about perspective, like what are we going to buy, how do we build our collections, and so that's looking at the gaps, sort of where are our gaps, and then just finding, I think there's no one-size-fits-all solution, and that libraries are going to have to decide which bite of the apple they're going to take in terms of maybe it's a local focus. Is there one of the beta libraries we work with on Choreo, they were very concerned with the local communities. So for instance, I learned on Staten Island, there's a very big Sri Lankan population. And so, I mean, that's very focused and very to that situation. And so, I think we're at the beginning. I do also see where shared print projects are more explicitly taking this on. There is an IMLS funded grant that the SCELC and the EAST shared print consortium or projects are looking at to bring on minority serving institutions to their projects, but also to do research around how do we characterize the diversity. So, can we profile differences between collections from different sorts of institutions? And so, I mean, from a data perspective, I'm curious and excited about that. Like, what can we do to sort of advance that inquiry? It's something that I think we're going to learn a lot from these libraries as we work with them, as they kind of struggle through these first few projects. And I kind of, maybe jumping to the looking forward piece, I'm thinking that, yes, some kind of methodology for assessing what part of the diversity or equity puzzle a library is going to tackle, and how does that translate into actual collections work, I think is something that, I'm excited about.
Yeah. Just to pick up on some of the things you were saying about interest in Choreo and other tools, I think another driver for this is shifting collections and programs. I think that a lot of the interest in diversity, equity, and inclusion across campuses is really leading to new and evolving curriculum focus, and particularly some of these programs are very interdisciplinary. So I think that that's also motivating collections librarians, is to think about what are the curricular needs and how do they tie to this on campus. And we heard quite a bit about diversification. And before we leave this topic of what this work looks like now, I just want to call attention to back to the really great work that's been done at Ithaca S&R. And if you haven't taken a look at that report, it really does have scattered throughout it a number of these kind of spotlights, which are sort of different sorts of exemplars that are happening across the organization. And another thing to emphasize about this report is this really, you guys did such a great job of looking at a whole range of things. So there's things included. We really focused on monograph collecting in our research, but your work really looks more broadly and includes things like special collections in it, which I think is great. So please do take a look at that report. It's included on the handout that we distributed. We want to turn now to talk about what this work looks like what it might look like in the future. So one of the things I'm going to kick off on this one and say that, with collection development, I think that you hear that, time and resources are always the thing that people wish that they had more of, and that people feel energized to do this work, but also squeezed. So they're looking for sustainable ways to do the work. And there is an awareness that if you're bringing in collections that are outside the mainstream, that are outside of your normal flows of things, that you're bringing in collections that may be more costly, not just in terms of on a per piece basis, but also in terms of the other types of special handling that they may need. So technical services work, they may need authority work or original cataloging. And one person said, I need to be very careful about that because my head of technical services is going to kill me if I bring in a lot of things that need original cataloging. Like that can't be. I have to remain friendly with people. And also that the materials may look different in terms of format. So we may be getting more things that are like PDFs that are created self-published things that come in different formats. And again, those would need different workflows and different types of processing. So I really was, people were thinking about not just, okay, I'm gonna bring these things in, but what about my entire workflows do I need to change to be able to accommodate materials that may look different than the current portfolio of collections. So I thought that was, thinking holistically about what this was going to look like. And as I am someone who has a background in special collections, I kind of grew up on the corner of digitization and special collections. So it was really, so for me, maybe everything sounds like special collections work, but it really was interesting to listen to people talk about how this work was different from their day-to-day. And it sounded to me like it has a lot in common with special collections. You're really getting closer to creators and people who are embedded within communities, and also that part about things that may need some special handling. So, perhaps there may be some skills that people who work in special collections can kind of bring to bear in terms of community building, in terms of thinking about special access points, in terms of thinking about the way that things are handled and cataloged to provide those access points. So that was a particular change. And then another Andy reference that we did ask people about lists, lists of material. And those could be lists from publishers, they could be lists that faculty had created, just what is the nature of lists. And while at these larger institutions, I think people weren't so interested in pre-created lists of material, there was an interest in looking at the lists and kind of backwards engineering them. And that's where the title for this session comes from one librarian who said, I want to think about creating a different kind of net. It's if something is on a list that's not in our collection, I don't want to just reflexively go out and collect that item. I want to take the opportunity to think, like, how did that item escape my grasp to begin with? How do I re-engineer my systems so that they're more inclusive from the get-go, so that I'm getting these materials so that they're not flowing by me, but I'm catching them. And I was really very, very taken with, I think those of us who reviewed this were really, that seemed like a really smart way to go about it, to think about you need to, we're existing within systems. If these systems aren't working, how do you re-engineer the system? And then again, this future of reparative collecting and partnering with organizations that are complementary to our own institutions that have that culture and that are of those communities seems like a promising way forward. And then finally, I'll just end with collective collections and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So people are very interested in benchmarking against others and also working within their collaborative networks, within people who are working with shared print networks, are just at the very beginning of thinking about this. I think that the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's very particular to your campus, what communities you serve, may be unique within your own environment, but people are starting to think about, how do I work with this with peers? And some of that is just taking inspiration from one another, but people are starting, I think, at the very, very beginning of thinking about how they do this work in a collective collection sort of way. So I'll pass things off to Andy next.
Thanks, Marilee. As I look at the future, just building on what you're saying, I see that there's libraries, there's a local focus where libraries can focus on the particulars of their community, of the aspects of diversity, equity, inclusion they want to pursue that sort of aligns with their mission, with what's going on sort of at the sort of policy level in the institution. And it may look very different from one institution to the other, and tied to that, the collective collections work. So in the shared print community, increasingly there's an attempt to socialize this notion of collective collection management, where shared print, which has traditionally been focused on preservation and retention, that it really extends to include the whole collection life cycle, from acquisition through to sort of end of life, deselection, whatever that looks like. And so with that in mind, I think there's an opportunity at the collective level for collaboration to happen, for tools to support that collaboration, so that certain goals and certain values can be promoted collectively that might be much more difficult to do individually. So the benefits of coming together, and so I'm excited to see what that looks like. How can we, with whether it's a tool like Chorio or some others, help libraries to sort of analyze a collective collection, whether it be their particular consortium, their resource sharing network, to be able to say, where are we lacking in materials, and that speaks to the benchmarking. So I think, again, while no real good benchmarks have emerged, and I suggest it's probably, maybe there's more of a methodology, because again, a one-size-fits-all solution is probably not going to work. But I think people want a way to say, how are we doing, according to, whatever, either it's a topical area or sort of a value that they want to see in their collection, and to somehow have the data support that. I see, on my wish list is, having more and better metadata to support this kind of decision making, whether it's metadata around, author metadata. So right now we just sort of have a name, but to be able to understand more about either the author's point of view or their ethnicity or other sort of identity characteristics. There's discussions and pros and cons, of course, to that, but I think there's a desire to do that, and whether it's also metadata about publishers and things like that. So we have a lot of metadata to work with now, but I think what I'm hoping is in this collective work, there will emerge a need or a desire and motivation to create maybe better metadata that can support this. So, and to the barriers, it's always time and resources. And so that's why I think if libraries can team up, in a collaborative way to advance, some of these objectives, while, also focusing in their own backyard on those, maybe smaller, more manageable pieces that they can attend to, whether it's collecting or how they steward their collection, what they set for retention. And one of the things that I've learned in doing collection analysis work for some time is all libraries have unique materials. I mean, uniqueness is often common, and so it's identifying those gems that should be retained, absolutely, but maybe also kind of lifted up and made more visible. So, and I'm hoping that that's something we can move towards.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I kind of piggybacking off of what you were pointing out, Andy, about the uniqueness of library collections. You know, if we start thinking about what this work might look like in the future, I've noticed that a number of institutions are specifically looking at their archives and their special collections. You know, part of SNR's work, we did a study for the Society of American Archivists, and you know, this work seemed to be front and center, focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we talked to a number of institutions that are trying to pull, let's say, the true stories of their institutions out of their special collections and their archives, so they can highlight the history of the organization, but also tie into the local community so that they can build those bridges that they, for all intents and purposes, either never built or sadly at times have burnt down. So the institutions that are trying to do this reparative work, a lot of that is coming out of the archives. And the University of Maryland recently, and you know, if this individual's in the room, congratulations, recently promoted somebody in their archives to really focus on reparative work within the special collections and archives. And that is the unique characteristic I think our libraries have, that, you know, we should be celebrating, but at the same time, it's something we need to lean in on. So that we can improve what that collection looks like and the way it represents the culture of the community that institution sits in. And you know, thinking about the barriers to this work, I think we have to be somewhat frank and say that, you know, we are not the most diverse profession. There is a lot of work to be done within collecting organizations to diversify our ranks, and I know those efforts have been made, and we've seen some improvement, but not the improvement we want to see. We need to have more voices in our field. We need to hear more diverse perspectives and look at this problem space and improve our environments and improve not only our collections, but our organizations. One thing I want to do before I completely close out here is to go back to something Marilee mentioned. You know, we're thinking of libraries and we're thinking of our collecting bodies, but within SNR, we also work across higher education. And one thing that I'm starting to recognize, and maybe this is because I'm an optimist, I'm seeing this, but there seems to be amongst faculty in higher education a deeper sense of responsibility on their behalf to want to make their courses and their classrooms more inclusive and build in a sense of belonging. And so they're being very reflective on their curriculum and their own pedagogy. You see a lot of this work with folks who are in the open education space, working with OER and trying to, you know, customize the material so it speaks to the student in the room, the whole student that's taking that class, either virtually or you know, virtually or physically. And then also, I believe our faculty now are starting to have better empathy for the life of the students that are taking their courses. And maybe this is a byproduct of the pandemic. We talked about this before we began. You know, maybe as a culture, we become more empathetic of the people that, you know, we inhabit planet Earth with. I'll go, you know, human beings do let us down occasionally if nobody's ever noticed, so maybe I'm being somewhat Pollyannish, but I'm really hopeful that there are barriers that will be addressed, because I believe that this work is paramount to all of us, and I believe there's passion in wanting to achieve it, and I don't see it slowing down.
But before we close out, just acknowledging that work that focuses on racism, othering, oppression, and just recognizing those things can be emotionally draining or exhausting no matter what level you're engaged in it. So it's really important to focus on you know, to kind of sustain yourself with the the positives and the excitement of this. And I think that that's coming through in our remarks. So we wanted to close out by talking a little bit about what we're most excited about in this space. So Mark, you can start with this one.
Thank you. I mean,
Continue.
I was very inspired by the program. You know, I remember looking at the sessions here at ACRL, and it really struck me that people want to continue discussing this and learn from each other. You know, one thing that I think is important, and I'm hoping this came across clearly in all our remarks, is there's this need to make sure that there's grace forever present in this work. And the one thing I'm hearing at this conference, and I've heard it in conversations that I'm part of, some conversations I'm eavesdropping on, is that there is this level of sharing and recognition of the efforts everybody's putting in to wanting not only to diversify the collections, but to also work to build a culture of inclusion within our organizations. And people are committed to this work. And so, you know, that to me is the most inspiring. And one last shout out I'd like to give are to the individuals in this room that are coming from states where there are barriers being put into place. I applaud you for wanting to continue this work. It's an inspiration to all of us. So I heard many of you speak up and have committed yourselves to continuing this work, even though in your own regions, in your own states, there may be people there who are trying to continue to build walls instead of taking them down.
Andy.
Thanks. As a human being, I'm excited that, you know, space is being made for these difficult conversations, and for that all this activity I see here at the conference that is, you know, very positive from the standpoint of just humanizing our profession and the work we do and the collections that you know, we work on and are involved in. So that's kind of just standing back. I'm happy to see that. That excites me. You know, as a collections analyst, you know, as a product person, I'm excited by, you know, what we can do with the metadata, the information we have, information, you know, WorldCat Holdings, the various data that we have to help inform these efforts and to support libraries that are, you know, kind of grappling with this, trying to figure it out. I'm actually excited about learning from the libraries we work with about, you know, how they use the tools, how we could make it better to, you know, to support more discernment on things that the collections we should preserve, collections we should acquire, and also that collaborative aspect. So like, how can our tools support collaboration? So, you know, getting back to that collective collection piece, I think that's a huge way that libraries can, you know, pool efforts, resources, you know, in an era of limited resources. So I think what I like to see is more, you know, more development, more, I don't know what's evolution, the strengthening of capacity around collaborative collection work. I've heard it said, I was at a session at Charleston, that there is collaboration around collections in some very narrow areas that are working well in, you know, language studies or area studies, but the idea is to make that collaborative mindset pervade, you know, all of collections work, and I think the DEI, you know, challenge opportunity provides a great focus for that collaboration.
Yeah. I would say that I am also energized by just kind of the level of conversation that I'm having, and just the frank and open engagement, and also the real dedication, and people thinking about this not being a, you know, a one-shot kind of thing, but an ongoing thing, and how do people build it into their workflows. I will also say that we approached a group of very busy people to engage with us around conversations in November and December last year, which is, you know, an incredibly busy time. And we thought, well, you know, people aren't going to have time to talk to us, but they made time to talk to us, and they made time to talk to us because they were eager to share with us so that they could hear back what others had to say. So very grateful to our OCLC Research Library partners and also those on Global Council that we reached out to, OCLC Global Council that we reached out to, who made connections with us, and that people were just really eager to share with us, and that I think is a great sign and a great signal. And I know within OCLC Research we're thinking about having a webinar series and discussion series that'll help extend this conversation, because people are really eager to talk to one another and to continue that conversation beyond conferences. So looking to kind of use our capacities and our power to convene to help keep those conversations going, to sustain people in between gatherings like this one. So, and also just, like Mark, just really energized by all of the discussions that I've had at this conference. So we have, I'm also energized by all of you who found your way over to the Westin on a Friday morning to join us. And there's a lot of expertise in this room, so we want to open it up to you all before we release you on to the rest of your conference.
In the rain, no less.
In the rain, yeah, exactly.